Hi, this is Robin from 8-Bit Show and Tell. I think it was about 1986. I was probably 13 years old, and I was given a new floppy disk, at least a new one to me. It's actually this one right here. At the time it didn't have the label, it didn't have the notch out, it was a brand new, and I was excited to get any new floppy disk because they were fairly expensive back then. I didn't have a lot of money, and I was using up disks as fast as I could get them. I'd buy a box of discs whenever I had the money, but when I didn't, I'd start deleting my old files or whatever if I needed it. So I don't know if my parents got this for me from work or a friend or whatever. I didn't notice anything unusual about it, so I went ahead and tried to format it. Well, it didn't work so well. I don't want to format this one for my example, but I've got another new disk here that, as you can see, is high density, and that's what was unusual. I don't think high density meant anything to me when I was 13. I was like, oh, that must be better or something. I put my new disk in my 1541 drive. At the time it was hooked up to a Commodore 64. And then I went ahead and tried to format the disk. So, I tried to do a directory on the new disk just to make sure it was blank. Nothing there. And I would do a format command like so. And I let it work. By the way, I always found it neat how on the Commodore 64 you would tell it to format a disk and you would go right back to the ready prompt, and meanwhile the disk drive's working away. It's kind of like I know it's not really multitasking, but it's because the disk drive does have its own processor. Anyway, the format failed, and that's what happened to me way back when on my new disk. So I tried again and again and again. I think maybe eventually it formatted, and then when I tried to save files to it, that failed too. So then I took a look at the disk and wondered, maybe there is something different about this HD. So I pulled it out of the envelope, and it looked a little bit different here. So I grabbed one of my other disks, and today, for your amusement, I'm going to be using the cheapest disks I own, Embassy Gold brand, Precision floppy diskettes. And here they were bought, they were sold at Bargain Herald's for $5.50 originally, eventually marked down to $1.99. Double side, double density, 5 1/4 inch discs. So I took one of those discs and compared it. Well, that's lovely. There's a crusty thing on there. I thought these were new. Anyway, it has this ring around it, a hub ring, while the high density disc does not have that. And just in case you think my 1541 didn't format that high density disc because it's faulty, I'm going to put that disc in here again. We'll load. Okay, again, nothing on it. And here we go. Format. Cheap disk. I forgot to close the file before. And there we go. It's formatting. It's interesting how you can continue using BASIC as long as you want, but if you issue another disk command, then it freezes up. You see here it's waiting to search. You can hear that clicking away. Each one of those clicks is a new track, and you can hear that so far at least it's formatting this disk fine. Probably going to fast forward this. And there we go. Formatted that. I don't know how old that old double density cheap embassy gold disc is with the kind of nasty thing on it, but it formatted fine. Cheap disc. Okay, well you might say, well, the cheap old double density disc is fine, but this high density disc that you had here, it's the problem. It's no good. Actually, in the early 2000s, my wife found a huge box of discs for sale. I don't know if it was at a yard sale or whatever. And she brought home, must have had 50 boxes of discs in it. And she was really excited about it. I was excited. And then I looked and I saw that almost all of them were high density. There were a few boxes of double density in there, but almost all of them were high density. I really just don't have much use for it. And I'd already learned my lesson from way back in the day that high density discs, they don't mix with Commodore computers. But I still have a bunch of these. This is a brand new box of discs. I'm going to open up this pocket knife that my aunt gave me almost the same time. I was probably about 13 when she gave it to me. Had ever since, never did lose it. So, brand new box of discs. This is for science. Okay, there we go. Brand new disc out of there. And this time, because I have my super snapshot here, I'm going to do a fast format, just so we don't have to wait so long. Try to... You notice it's not clicking, it's just spinning for a while. And there it gave up. Read the error channel. Read error. Okay, so that's just failing again. And just to hammer it home, I've got my disc notcher here. So that same embassy gold disc I was using. We'll hold that and give it a punch here. Ooh. There. Now we've got a notch on both sides. And I'm going to try a fast format on the second side. New, try cheapo 2. And there you can tell it's clicking away. Oh, not a totally good format. This sometimes happens. And while that's formatting again, I'm going to try and double side this high density disc. And it's not cutting all the fuzz out of that quite right there. That's pretty good. And there we go. A good format. Not entirely sure why I have that problem happen every so often when I'm formatting a disk with the fast super snapshot format that takes 2 tries like that. Okay, and just for one more, I'm going to try the back side. This is that high density disk. I'm going to try the back side of it. Okay, and to format that, HD try 3, I don't know, try H3, whatever. And again, it's just not clicking. No go. So back to the differences between the high density disks and the double density disks. The hub ring is expected by double density drives, and when you put the disk in the drive and close the door, then the mechanism clamps down on that hub ring, which is a little bit raised. If you can quite see it there. And it's just missing on the high density disks. So that might cause the drive to not work sometimes if it's not grabbing onto the disk properly to spin it. But a bigger difference is that the double density disks actually have a different magnetic coating on them. It uses iron oxide coating, which has a coercivity, and that's like the strength of the magnetic field required to affect it, of 300 Oersteds. I hope I'm saying that right. I'm no physicist, I've just read up on this a bit. So 300 Oersted coercivity with an iron oxide coating on the double density disks, and the high density have a cobalt coating which has a coercivity rating of 600 Oersteds. And so I've heard that the disk drive has to generate a higher magnetic field to write to a high density disk. So I guess, I don't know if it's twice the strength, but anyway, it has to hit that 600 Oersteds. So there's an actual physical difference between the coating on these disks and the magnetic property of it. And a double density disk drive doesn't put out a strong enough magnetic field to affect it. That's actually not always the case. The reason I'm bringing this up is because there's a recent Facebook post where somebody had a web shop and they were trying to sell high density floppy disks. They didn't specify it as that, but when you look at the picture, you could see that they're high density. And the fellow said, oh, they work fine for me. Well, this is an argument that pops up online often. After my bad experience with these high density disks over the years, I just found I'm just not going to use them anymore because they're just too much trouble. Maybe sometimes you can write to them, but it just often fails. This fellow was saying, oh, I've written to 15 of them and they're all fine. Now, I don't think he's lying. It's just interesting that people have such different experiences with them. I think one thing that might happen is that some Commodore disk drives have a stronger field. I don't know if they could be miscalibrated or just maybe it varies from drive to drive. So maybe some of them, the right head generates a stronger magnetic field, and maybe it varies from high density disk from one to another. Perhaps the coating varies a little and it actually requires a weaker field to write to them. I'm not calling anybody a liar. I think that they're telling the truth that it works for them, but I just want to make it clear that for at least some disk drives that are working properly, that are working as expected, and can clearly write to double density disks, that they have trouble with high density media. And so generally you should just stay away from them. If it works for you, that's fine, but I'd recommend against selling them to somebody else, because that could cause that customer to have a bad experience. And then also, of course, it's going to affect your own reputation. Now, I'd like to show an exception to this. I'm just going to power down the 128D again. I'm going to take both of these disk drives away here. So something I noticed was that my 128D here, the internal floppy drive, actually seems to handle high density disks just fine. Okay, so this is the disk I've tried to format several times. It's in here. Now I'm going to try it this time, I don't know, TT. And there's the clicking. So it's probably going to be a successful format. How about that? Seems to be working fine. Let's even write to it. I'm just going to go into the monitor here and fill memory from 1000 to 8000 with a pattern. Just make sure that looks good. Okay, so I filled memory with just the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 over and over again. And the reason I'm doing that is that the Super Snapshot cartridge, which I have plugged in here, the reason I got that snapshot name was for its snapshot feature, which is basically like saving the state. Like in an emulator, you can save state. This was a similar thing for the C64, and it was originally used to back up programs. You would just save all of memory to a file, and then you could load it in again. And it was useful both for defeating some kinds of copy protection, but also for actually saving your game in a game that doesn't allow you to otherwise save. So we'll go in and use the snapshot feature. And the reason I filled memory with that pattern is that it shouldn't compress nearly as good. So let's try it here. This is test 1. Okay, so 214 blocks. Basically, the snapshot does attempt to compress memory, but when there's a pattern in memory like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 over and over again, it can't compress it very well. Run length encoding will shrink repeating single-digit sequences very well. So anyway, I'm going to just save that to that newly formatted disk. The only reason I'm doing this is just to show that actually these kind of disks work totally fine, my 128D, for whatever reason. Okay, and there we go. Saved okay. And resume. And let's even restart the computer here. The directory, there's the file. Let's try loading it. And there, it loaded fine. Okay, so obviously these disks work okay in some situations. So my 128D, it happens to work in the 1541. It doesn't, even though both can successfully write to double density disks as is intended. Just want to take a moment for new 8-bit stuff. And I received this in the mail, Old School Gamer magazine. I subscribed to this on Patreon after Brian from Brian's Man Cave did an episode. Brian's Man Cave is another Canadian YouTube channel. He's a Commodore 64 fan as well as an Intellivision fan. I like his stuff, and actually we invited him onto our Commodore 64 User's Guide podcast, Growing Up 80s, that I do with Darren Folds. So anyway, check out our podcast, check out Brian's Man Cave. I'll put a link down below. But this magazine looked interesting, and it's quite affordable. It's got quite a few interesting articles. The writers seem quite good. The Untold Story of Highlander, the video game. There's very few ads in it, so it feels almost like a journal. Some of the articles aren't particularly technical, but I had this article here about Battlezone by Kevin Butler. And he actually interviews the original programmer of the arcade Battlezone game, whose name is Ed Rotberg, and actually gets quite technical. So yeah, Ed talks about his story, how he got involved doing arcade programming. There's even some examples of assembly code. And then he talks about how the arcade Battlezone game actually has a math coprocessor that they designed. They called it the Math Box. And it was Michael Alba, who's one of the designers of the Math Box. They actually interview him about the 3D math that Battlezone does. So the 6502 actually doesn't do all the 3D math. So there's an interview with him. Anyways, I'm pretty impressed. Also, good article about adventure games, focusing on Stuart Smith, who was a very legendary adventure game programmer. It's surprisingly good articles, and it's quite cheap to subscribe on Patreon for the print copy, or there's even, I believe, a free digital version. So it's worth checking out. One more thing about the high-density disks. It may be that even if you write to them successfully, the data written to them isn't going to last as long or as reliably as that written to double-density disk. I've read some reports that people who successfully write to a high-density disk like I have find that after days or weeks that the data becomes unreadable. So that's something else to keep in mind. So I realize that this isn't necessarily a completely scientific 100%. I'm mostly just wanting to make people aware so that if they do choose to go and buy high-density disks and use them in their Commodore system, they may end up having trouble, and you're probably better off spending your money tracking down some double-density disks and buying those instead. Okay, thanks for watching. Should do more programming again next time. Let me know what you'd like to see in future episodes. Again, I've got lots of ideas. This issue of the high-density and double-density disks is something that's come up a number of times, and I just want to make an episode that demonstrates the problems with using these disks. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe and hit that bell icon so that you'll be notified for future updates. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you next time.
Get the Micadon experience working for you. Their knowledgeable sales staff will help you select the right home computer for your needs. Experience it. IBM compatible machines, Amiga, and the Atari ST. Take advantage of Thunder Bay's largest software collection for Amiga, IBM, C64, Apple, Macintosh, and more. Even a wide selection of Nintendo and Sega Genesis cartridges, and educational software too. Micadon, 267 Park Avenue and in the County Fair Plaza. Thunder Bay's complete computer centers.